At my husband's funeral no one came but me. My children chose parties over their father's goodbye. The next morning I crossed their names out of my will. The church smelled of lilies and dust, the kind of silence that presses against your chest until breathing feels like guilt. I sat in the front pew, clutching Dean's old wedding ring, the gold worn thin from decades of hard work. The hymn echoed off the empty walls, and for a moment I pretended the doors would open, that one of my children would rush in out of breath, saying they made it just in time. But no one came. Caleb had texted, "Sorry mom, flight's delayed. I'll visit next weekend." Renee posted a picture on Instagram from a beach party, champagne in her hand. Ty never replied at all. Just a video from a bar, laughing with friends while I stood over his father's coffin. I wanted to hate them, but hate takes energy. I didn't have much left. Dean used to say, "Family is everything." He believed it so fiercely that he worked himself into an early grave, providing for everyone but himself. I used to think his kindness would come back around, that our children would inherit it the way they inherited his eyes. But kindness, it seems, isn't genetic. It's a choice, and they stopped choosing a long time ago. When the pastor asked if I wanted to say a few words, my voice cracked before I could begin. "He was a good man," I managed. That was all. I couldn't talk about the nights we spent dreaming for a family that never truly existed beyond photographs and holidays. I couldn't talk about the loneliness that crept in even while the house was full. After the service, I sat in the car watching the rain blur the windshield. Dean's ring lay on my palm, still warm from my skin. I whispered to him, "They buried more than you today, Dean. They buried my forgiveness too." The next morning I made coffee for one, opened the drawer where our will sat, and with steady hands, drew a line through each of their names. For the first time in years, the silence in the house didn't hurt. It felt like peace. The night before Dean passed, I knew something was different. The air felt heavy, and even the ticking clock sounded slower. I sat by his bedside, holding his hand, feeling how weak his pulse had become. His breathing was uneven, soft and shallow. I whispered to him that I loved him and that it was okay to rest, though my voice broke halfway through the words. I picked up my phone and called Caleb first. The call went to voicemail. I tried again, praying he'd answer, but instead I got a short text, "I'll come next week, Mom." My heart sank. Dean didn't have a next week. I called Renee next. No answer. I scrolled through social media, and there she was, smiling in a group photo, glass of wine in hand, the caption reading, "Much needed night out." I didn't even bother calling Ty at first, I already knew. But I tried anyway. No response. Then a few minutes later I saw his story, a video of him laughing at a bar, music blasting in the background. I sat there in the dim light, the sound of Dean's breathing growing fainter with each minute. I wanted to scream, to beg them to come, but what good would that do? I held Dean's hand tighter and whispered, "They're busy, but I'm here." His fingers twitched slightly, and I told myself he heard me. The night stretched on forever. I counted each breath, afraid to blink. Around 3 a.m. his breathing slowed even more until I couldn't tell if he was still there. I pressed my fingers to his wrist. Nothing. The room went silent in a way that felt final. I didn't cry right away. I just sat there, frozen, listening to the quiet that had replaced the man I loved. When the first light of morning slipped through the curtains, I checked my phone again. No new messages. No missed calls. Just that same text from Caleb sitting there like a cruel reminder. I stared at their photos on the wall. The smiling faces, the moments I thought meant something, and felt something inside me close. That night I lost my husband. But in the same breath I lost my children too. I realized love can fade quietly, not with arguments or distance, but with silence that no one bothers to fill. When I look back on how we raised our children, I wonder where things went wrong. Dean and I started with nothing but hope. We lived in a small house with leaky pipes and old furniture, but it was filled with laughter back then. I worked long hours, sometimes 2 jobs, just to make sure the bills were paid and the kids had what they needed. Dean always said, "Family is everything," and I believed him with all my heart. We didn't have much, but we tried to make every moment feel special. Birthdays were homemade cakes, not fancy parties. Christmas meant knitted sweaters and small surprises under the tree. The kids never knew how many nights I went without dinner so they could eat seconds, or how often Dean fixed broken things instead of buying new ones. We told ourselves it was worth it because they'd grow up knowing love mattered more than money. Caleb was always the serious one. Renee had a spark that filled every room, and Ty followed them everywhere, eager to fit in. I thought the bond between us would last forever. When they fell, I was there with bandages and hugs. When they failed, I told them that trying again was what mattered. I wanted them to know that home was where they'd always be safe. But as they grew older, things began to shift quietly. Calls became shorter. Visits turned into obligations. Their lives grew faster, brighter, and further away from ours. Dean noticed it too, but he never said much. He'd just sigh and say, "They'll come around." I clung to that hope for years. I remember the last Christmas before Dean got sick. We waited all day for them to arrive. Caleb said he was too busy, Renee had a trip planned, and Ty didn't even answer his phone. Dean sat at the table, the food untouched, staring at the empty chairs. I told him maybe next year would be better, but he just smiled sadly. I think he knew it wouldn't. Now, when I think about all the effort we gave, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, I don't feel anger as much as emptiness. We taught them to love, but maybe we also taught them that love would always wait. We never stopped giving even when they stopped caring. Maybe being too forgiving was my mistake. Because when love was finally tested, they weren't there. After the funeral, I wanted to hear my children's voices one more time. Not to argue or forgive, just to understand. I called Caleb first. The phone rang until it stopped. I waited, then called again. Nothing. No message, no text. Just silence. I stared at my phone for a long time, wondering when it became so easy for him to ignore me. I tried Renee next. She answered after a few rings, her voice sharp and impatient. I asked how she was, but she barely listened. When I mentioned her father, she sighed and said, "Mom, I already said I was sorry." Her words sounded more like a defense than an apology. Before I could respond, she ended the call. The line went dead and I just sat there holding the phone to my ear as if it would bring her back. I didn't even bother calling Ty right away. He was always quick to dismiss anything emotional. Hours later, a text appeared on my screen. "You're being dramatic, Mom." 3 careless words. No punctuation, no warmth, just distance. I read it over and over until I finally turned the phone face down. The house was completely still. I walked to the living room and stopped in front of the old family photo. Our last perfect moment. Dean had his arms around all 3 kids and I was standing beside him, smiling like everything in life made sense. That picture used to bring me comfort. Now it only reminded me of how long I'd been pretending that we were still the same family. I stood there for a while trying to decide whether to take it down. But I didn't. Instead, I looked at those smiling faces and felt something close off inside me. The love I had spent years protecting suddenly felt tired, used up. I realized I had been holding on to people who had already moved on. I went to bed without checking my phone again. There were no missed calls when I woke up the next morning. That was the moment I stopped expecting them to care. It wasn't anger anymore, just acceptance. The kind that doesn't need words or explanations. The kind that comes when you finally understand that silence is its own answer. The morning after I decided to make the calls, I woke up with a strange calmness. I brewed my coffee, packed Dean's old will into a folder and got into the car. The drive to Lydia Grant's office felt longer than usual, though I'd driven that road hundreds of times before. Lydia had been our lawyer for over 20 years. She'd seen our family grow, struggle, and pretend to hold together. I knew she'd have questions, but I was ready for them. When I walked into her office, she looked up from her desk and smiled gently. "Mara, I'm so sorry about Dean," she said, placing a hand over mine. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. She asked if I was there to make updates for the kids, assuming it was a routine visit. I handed her the folder and said quietly, "I want to change everything." Her brows lifted, but she didn't interrupt. I told her I wanted to remove my children from the will entirely. No hesitation, no emotion, just truth. She looked at me for a long moment before asking, "Are you sure, Mara? Maybe give it some time." I met her eyes and said, "I've already given them years." She leaned back, studying me carefully, maybe waiting for a crack in my resolve. But there wasn't one. For the first time in a long time, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Lydia opened the file, her pen hovering above the paper. "Then who do you want to leave it to?" she asked softly. I didn't have an answer yet. I only knew who didn't deserve it. All those years of saving, of planning for their futures, it all seemed foolish now. I thought about the nights Dean and I stayed up talking about our kids' dreams, about giving them everything we never had. He believed they'd cherish it, that they'd honor what we built together. I once believed that too. While Lydia worked through the paperwork, I sat quietly, listening to the scratching of her pen. My hands were still shaking, but not from doubt, more from relief. The decision felt like finally setting down a weight I'd been carrying for decades. When she asked me to review and sign, I didn't hesitate. As I signed my name at the bottom, something in me loosened. It wasn't revenge, it was closure. I didn't feel guilt, only peace. Lydia placed her hand on mine again and said gently, "You're a brave woman, Mara." I gave a small smile and told her I wasn't brave, just done waiting for people who stopped showing up. When I walked out of her office, the air felt lighter. I didn't know yet where the money would go, but I knew one thing for certain. It would go somewhere it mattered. Not to those who forgot what family meant, but to something or someone who still understood love wasn't just a word. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after the clock struck midnight. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Dean's picture sat in front of me, his smile soft and kind, the same way it had always been. I poured myself some tea, but it went cold before I touched it. I had something to do, something I'd been avoiding for far too long. I took out 3 sheets of paper and wrote their names at the top. Renee. For a while I just stared at the blank pages, not knowing where to begin. I didn't want to write out of anger. I had already felt enough of that. I wanted to write the truth, plain, simple, and final. I started with Caleb. I told him how proud I was of his hard work and how I always believed he'd do well in life. But I also told him how it felt to become a burden instead of a mother. I reminded him that respect means more than sending gifts on holidays or short messages that feel like obligations. I wrote that I loved him deeply, but I could no longer keep pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Renee's letter was harder. I told her she had inherited Dean's charm and confidence, but I wished she had also kept his kindness. I reminded her that beauty can open doors, but empathy keeps them from closing. I told her I wasn't angry for her absence, just sad that she had forgotten the family that once meant everything to her. I wrote that I hoped one day she would understand that caring for someone doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. Then came Ty. I stared at his page the longest. He had always been the one who laughed the loudest, who found joy in everything. Somewhere along the way, that warmth had turned into indifference. I told him I forgave him for the words he sent and the silence that followed. But I also told him that forgiveness didn't mean I'd keep waiting. I wrote that I was done being the only one who showed up. When the letters were finished, I folded them carefully and placed them into envelopes. Each one felt heavier than it should have, as if every word carried years of love, disappointment, and truth. I sealed them and set them beside Dean's picture. The tea on the table had gone completely cold. I sat back and looked at the envelopes lined up neatly. I didn't cry. I had no tears left. The words said everything I couldn't anymore. They were my goodbye, not out of bitterness but out of acceptance. A few weeks after the funeral, I was in the garden trimming the roses when I saw a man standing by the gate. He looked unsure whether to come closer. His clothes were worn and his hands were rough, like someone used to hard work. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "Mrs. Turner? I worked for your husband a long time ago. My name's Eli Mercer." I invited him in and we sat on the porch. He held his cap in his hands, turning it nervously. He said he'd been meaning to visit but didn't want to intrude during the funeral. I told him it was all right, that it felt good to have company for once. He smiled faintly and said, "Dean was a good man. The best boss I ever had." Eli began to tell me stories about the construction firm Dean used to run. He said Dean never treated anyone like they were beneath him, no matter where they came from. "He gave me a chance when nobody else would," Eli said, his voice low. I asked what he meant, and he hesitated before admitting that he had spent time in prison years ago. When he got out, no one wanted to hire him. Dean had looked at his record, then looked at him and said, "Everyone deserves a second shot." Hearing that didn't surprise me. Dean had always believed in helping people. Still, it warmed something in me that had gone cold. Eli said he had turned his life around after that job. He now ran a small youth workshop, teaching young people carpentry and repair skills. "It's small," he said with a shy grin. "Some weeks I can barely keep the lights on. But it keeps a few kids out of trouble." We sat quietly for a while after that. The wind moved through the trees and the garden smelled like wet earth. Eli talked about how Dean used to stay late on Fridays just to help the crew finish a project. He laughed a little, remembering how Dean once fixed an old truck himself because the company couldn't afford a mechanic. I could see the respect in his eyes. When he stood to leave, he said softly, "Your husband changed my life. I just wanted you to know." I thanked him, though my throat tightened around the words. After he left, I stayed on the porch watching the sunlight fade over the garden. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel completely alone. Hearing Eli speak reminded me that Dean's kindness hadn't died with him. It had found its way into someone else's hands. When Eli left that day, I couldn't stop thinking about what he said. The next week, I decided to visit his workshop myself. It was in an old warehouse on the edge of town, nothing fancy, cracked walls, paint peeling, tools scattered everywhere. But the moment I stepped inside, I heard laughter. Real, bright laughter that filled the place like sunlight. A group of kids were crowded around a broken bike, arguing playfully about which part went where. One of them noticed me and called out, "You're Mr. Turner's wife, right?" I nodded, surprised they even knew who I was. Eli walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked embarrassed, saying, "It's not much, but we make do." I told him it was more than enough. There was life here, something my house had been missing for years. These kids didn't have much, but they had drive. They reminded me of Dean, stubborn, hopeful, trying to build something even when the world didn't give them the best tools. Eli showed me around, explaining how they repaired donated furniture and sold it to cover rent. He mentioned they sometimes skipped meals when funds ran low, but he said it with a smile, like he'd already accepted the struggle. I watched him guide a young boy who couldn't have been more than 12, showing him how to sandwood safely. His patience was quiet but steady. Before I left, I stood in the doorway watching everyone work. My heart felt heavy and light at the same time. I hadn't realized how much I missed being around purpose, around people who cared about something beyond themselves. That night, I sat in my study for a long time, staring at Dean's old photograph. I thought about all the years we spent building a home, raising children who couldn't even bother to come to his funeral. Then I thought of those kids at Eli's workshop, covered in sawdust but smiling like the world still had space for them. It wasn't a difficult choice. I picked up the phone and called Lydia, my lawyer. Her voice was surprised when she answered so late. I told her I wanted to update the will again. She asked softly, "Are you sure, Mara?" I said yes. This time I was completely sure. Every cent, every piece of land, every bit of what Dean and I worked for, it would all go to Eli's youth center in Dean's name. I wanted his kindness to keep living through the hands of those kids. My children had made their choice when they turned away from me. Now I was making mine. For once, I wasn't acting out of pain or anger. I was acting out of peace. And for the first time in years, that peace finally felt like home. It was a quiet morning when I heard the knock. Slow, deliberate. I already knew who it was before I opened the door. Caleb stood there, jaw tight, eyes full of resentment. Behind him were Renee and Ty, both wearing expressions I couldn't read, somewhere between disbelief and anger. Caleb didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside and said, "So it's true then? You gave everything away? To some stranger?" His words were sharp, almost trembling with rage. I didn't answer right away. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat down, and looked at him the way I used to when he was a boy throwing tantrums over broken toys. Renee crossed her arms, her tone cold. "Do you have any idea how this looks? People are talking, Mom. They think you've lost it." Ty stayed near the doorway, scrolling on his phone like he couldn't even bear to make eye contact. I told them calmly that I hadn't lost anything, not anymore. They began talking over one another, voices rising. They said Dean would never have wanted this, that I was being emotional, that I was trying to punish them. But all I heard was noise. They spoke about fairness, inheritance, and image. Not one of them mentioned love. Not one said they missed their father. I looked at their faces, grown adults who once used to run through this house laughing, who once hugged me just to feel safe. Now they stood there like strangers who wanted something from me. I let them finish their accusations. Every word fell flat, echoing in the silence that followed. When the room finally went quiet, I spoke. My voice didn't shake. I told them they had made their choices. They decided what kind of children they wanted to be long before I changed my will. I reminded them that I had begged them to come when their father was dying and they didn't. I told them that money couldn't fill what they had already emptied: love, respect, time. Caleb muttered something under his breath, but I didn't ask him to repeat it. Renee turned away, eyes wet but full of pride. Ty sighed and walked out first, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house, but I didn't flinch. After they left, the silence returned, thick but not painful this time. It was peaceful. I sat there for a long while listening to the clock tick, realizing that letting go wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet. It was final. That morning I understood something simple. I wasn't losing my family. I was just releasing what was already gone. The morning air was cool when I walked to the cemetery. The ground was damp from last night's rain and the world felt still, like it was holding its breath. Dean's grave looked peaceful under the soft light. I brushed a few leaves off the stone and stood there quietly. For the first time I didn't cry. I just spoke to him like he was sitting beside me the way he used to at breakfast. I told him everything was done. The papers were signed, the will was changed, and the house finally felt calm. I said I hoped he'd understand my decision, that I couldn't keep carrying the weight of disappointment any longer. The wind moved through the trees and for a moment I could smell lilacs. It made me smile. That scent always followed him in spring. I placed 3 letters at the base of his stone. 1 for each of our children. I didn't write to make them feel guilty. I just wanted them to know I loved them once, fully and without limits. But love cannot live where respect has died. I hoped one day they would read the words and understand the silence that followed their choices. I stood there for a while, listening to the soft rustle of leaves and distant birds. I whispered a goodbye, not to Dean but to the life we built and the version of me that kept waiting for people to change. Then I turned and walked away, not looking back. There was no sadness in my steps, just a quiet kind of relief. The next morning I woke early. The sun was barely breaking through the curtains. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window. For once the house didn't feel empty. It felt mine. The air smelled fresh and everything looked lighter. I thought about how strange it was to find peace after so much loss, but peace doesn't come when you hold on. It comes when you finally let go. As the sunlight filled the room, I realized I wasn't waiting for anyone anymore. I wasn't a wife missing her husband or a mother hoping for calls that never came. I was just me, and for the first time in years that was enough. Do you think I did the right thing by cutting them off, or should I have given my children another chance? Tell me in the comments, I really want to know. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like mine.